Are You Nuts? A Tom and Scott Mystery, Book 7. Author Mark Richard Zubro. St. Martin's Press, New York. Eric Aust, narrator. Chapter 4. To get to my new home, you take Interstate 80 west to the second exit past Interstate 55, and then go south. After my last home burned down, I brought 50 acres of prime farmland within an easy commute of work. I was out of Cook County now and in Grundy County. I had picked the location because of its distance from any town. I enjoyed the peace and quiet. I love Chicago and Scott's penthouse on Lakeshore Drive, but for real living, give me a nice flat prairie and lots of space. The house is a ranch style with 3 wings forming a U. The open end faces west with picture windows at the tip of each leg. I get a spectacular view of the sunset from numerous vantages. A center courtyard enclosed by the U had what was supposed to have been a flower garden. I took a course in basic plant how-to. Everything I planted died within a month. Finally, I'd re-totilled the whole thing and planted grass seed. I thought in the future I might hire someone to put in a wooden deck. The north wing has the master bedroom, library, and electronics center. The opposite wing has the kitchen, office, and guest rooms. The center core is a vast living room. I furnished the new house carefully. Losing everything in a fire is horrific, but it does give you a chance to start totally fresh, assembling a household. The best example I can think of to illustrate my decorating style is my search for furniture. I was looking for a couch, so I became a denizen of every furniture store within 50 miles. I sat and or laid on one Davenport after another until I found the most comfortable one, and then bought it. I used the same method for finding recliners, love seats, or king-sized bed, and other odds and ends. After picking out something, I would then tell the salesperson that I wanted items to match what I had just purchased. The result is, I have clumps of furniture that match perfectly in juxtaposition with nearby groups that don't necessarily go together. On the other hand, nothing is extravagantly flashy, so nothing clashes horribly. However, my goal was achieved. All of it was immensely comfortable and based on what I wanted. Sometimes I'd bring Scott with me on these buying excursions. He has less taste than I do, but his place has an organized to perfection look. That's because he cheated and hired a decorator to help him. This I refused to do. For the walls, I picked out the posters or prints I liked the most and had them framed. Hanging in the library are my favorites of the moment. Posters from the movies Stonewall and Beautiful Thing. I have on order an action shot of Scott pitching. He looks incredible with his muscles straining, crotch cup bulging. Full color, one of a kind. A friendly newspaper photographer gave me the original. I had spent most of the last spring working on the design for the fields within 200 yards of the house. With the help of various nursery personnel and landscape artists, I had planned carefully. I took great care to assure tons of shade for the house without blocking any of the view. By the time all the trees and bushes that were planted grow, it will look like a well-organized mini forest. Scott and I looked very butch in late winter and early spring, muffled to the eyes against the cold as we helped plant some of the floor. I discovered the keys to a successful forest were don't overplant and have patience. The drive to the front door is going to be shaded by poplars and oaks that will meet overhead. Quite often I picked trees that bloomed most gloriously in spring, crab apples and dogwood, or that turned the most vibrant colors in fall, tupelos, sugar maple, hickory, along with stands of sassafras bushes. 1/3 of the basement is a workout room. Before supper, I spent an hour down there using the new equipment Scott had bought me as a housewarming present. A little after 10, Scott called from Seattle. He gave me the nightly report. I did 2 sports radio call-in shows and an early morning television program. It is a good thing I've learned the answers and the questions by heart. When I was with him, I had experienced the same phenomenon. The difficulty was the questions might be the same to us, but the answers were generally fresh to each audience that was listening. I said, "You sound exhausted." I whipped. I walked out of another interview before it even started. What happened? The usual. From the first show we did, both he and I had refused to be on any program with a representative from the religious right or any other hate group. We made this clear before agreeing to be on any program. 3 times, when we walked in, a host had said something like, "Oh, by the way, I just happened to have so-and-so from..." And it would be some loon from an anti-gay group. The people on the programs were stunned when we reiterated our refusal and walked out. Neither Scott nor I were about to debate our rights, our sexuality, or our lives with anyone, much less some religious fanatic. Scott continued, "What I'd really like to do is go off to our cabin up north. Better yet, I could buy us a home in the Vale of Kashmir, where no one knows us. I've got a phone message here from the Kashmir Post-Gazette. They want to interview you." And that got a small chuckle out of him. "I'd get my left nut to be in your arms right now." For the next few minutes, we were as tender and endearing to each other as any 2 people could be without being in each other's presence. I felt a pleasant glow after the call. When he's gone on road trips in the summer, I like to stay up late reading. Perhaps the most relaxing thing in the world to me is having the window open late on a summer evening, lounging in oversized t-shirt, gym shorts, and sweat socks. My feet up, one lamp on in the whole house, sitting in my chair reading a book, the glorious silence interrupted, perhaps by the rustle of the wind or a distant train whistle, the rare swish of a car on the far-off road, accompanied by a night bird or insect serenade. Capped off with a good book, it is totally perfect. This time I picked up Volume 3 of A History of Private Life. At midnight, I wondered briefly why Meg hadn't called. Certainly the meeting couldn't go that late. I don't remember what time it was when I fell asleep in my easy chair with the book on my lap. I woke to the ringing of the phone. It was nearly 4 a.m. My first thoughts were that something terrible had happened to Scott, or my mom and dad. I leaped up quickly. My book clattered to the floor. When I picked up the receiver, the line crackled for several seconds. It sounded as if I were being called from a payphone in a crowded bar on the far side of the moon. I said hello, but got no answer. I was about to hang up when a muffled and distant voice came over the line. "Tom Mason?" "Who is this?" "Agnes Davis. I was at the meeting tonight with Meg." Then I heard nothing for several seconds, but finally Agnes's voice came through much clearer and louder. The background noises receded somewhat. Agnes sounded exhausted and frightened. "I know you're Meg's closest friend. I've been trying to find out what they've done to her. She's been arrested for murder." Someone in the background of where she was shouted, "Stop that, you son of a bitch!" This was followed by several loud thumps and crashes. "What's happened?" I asked. "Jerome Blenkinsop is dead. Meg needs help. Can you get here?" "Where are you, Agnes?" "At a payphone in the visitors section of the River's Edge police station." A deep, gruff voice shouted, "Hurry it up!" I heard Agnes answer, "Back off, you tub of goo!" I said, "I'll call a lawyer and be right there." "Thank you. Try to hurry." I hung up and dialed my lawyer. Todd Bristol was a good friend. He'd been my lawyer since before I met Scott. Now we kept him on a yearly retainer. He was a partner in one of the big law firms on LaSalle Street in Chicago. I woke him up and explained the situation. He'd met Meg and knew how close we were. He said he would drive out from the city immediately. I changed clothes, grabbed my keys and wallet, and hurried to meet Agnes. River's Edge is one of the oldest southwestern suburbs of Chicago, founded soon after Blue Island. From its outward appearance, you'd guess the police station was the first building erected after the founding. Across the street, a new headquarters was under construction. The same population increase that had required new schools had forced them to build a new police station. Due to cost overruns, environmental lawsuits, weather delays, and bureaucratic snafus, it might not be finished until the middle of the next century. One forlorn, windowless wall was up. The builder seemed to have matched perfectly the dirty, yellow, grime-encrusted bricks of the original. 3 of the mayor's opponents had filed a lawsuit accusing him of mismanagement of the construction. Shattered glass, broken bottles, and rusted beer cans decorated the ground from the heaps of dirt near the new edifice to the unmown lawn and scraggly bushes around the old building. Inside the first floor continued the ugliness scheme. Begun outside, chips of paint peeled off the walls, scratches and nicks, beyond counting, scored the solid mahogany admitting counter. The smell of mold and mildew struck offensively. The windows were open, but no breeze stirred to relieve the beastly humidity. What had been pleasant at home amid the fields and trees became oppressive here in the confining enclosure. 5 in the morning felt as awful as high noon. Strips of tape with dead bugs clotted on them hung from the ceiling. The few times I'd been in the station recently, the same cop seemed to be working the admitting desk. He saw me and carefully put down his paperback book, Total Blather, by Daisy Mardet. With loud grunts and groans suggesting he would die if forced to move faster than slow motion, he stood up, hitched his belt over his 60-year-old paunch, and harumphed over to the counter. Retirement had to be a day or two away. The only fan in evidence sat in the middle of his desk. It was small, but aimed directly at his dry armpits. I asked for Frank Murphy. He and I used to work together with whacked-out teens when he was in the juvenile division. He'd been in homicide the past few years. During that time, we had seen much less of each other, but he was still a friend and the only contact I had in the department. I doubted if he'd be in at this hour, but it was worth a try. Frank was not available, and I would not be able to see the prisoner. They were processing her. I desperately wanted to know what had happened. Meg was probably less than 50 feet away, and I couldn't speak to her. Unable to see Meg, I said, "I'm looking for Agnes Davis, a friend of mine." "She arrested too?" "Oh, no, she's a mutual friend. She called me from here." "We don't keep a record of friends' phone calls." "Where do friends of arrested people usually make phone calls from?" He pointed down a gloomy corridor. I finally found Agnes in a waiting room with 2 pop machines that both had out-of-order signs. The dingy space smelled like burnt coffee. 2 of the overhead lights blinked on and off at random intervals. Outside, the pale-streaked window, early gray dawn, was breaking. We were the only ones in the waiting area. The rest of the friends of the criminals of River's Edge, like sensible people, were home in bed. As I walked into the human holding rooms, Agnes stood up from a folding chair. She hugged me. "Oh, thank you," she said. "A million thank yous." In her early 70s, she was usually sprightly and lively. This morning her shoulders slumped, her hair was wildly askew, and every furrow on her face looked like a deep scar. We sat on a bench worn down by the butts of offenders for perhaps 100 years. "What happened?" I asked. "Meg told me the story before the police arrested her. Blenkinsop got bashed with a Smith's Comprehensive Encyclopedia." "Why have they arrested Meg?" "During the PTA meeting tonight, things were said and threats were made. Worse, they found her purse next to the dead body. Much worse, they have her fingerprints on the murder weapon." "Can you give me all the details from the beginning?" "Before the body was found, the evening had been awful. Afterward, there was chaos for hours. Police, school administrators, and board members, teachers, parents, kids, just everybody were running around." My lawyer hurried into the room. Todd was tall and waspishly thin. He wore an impeccably cut dark gray suit with a severely starched white shirt. If you used a microscope, you might find the faint red stripes in his dark gray tie. I'd only ever seen him dressed as if for court or a funeral. If I asked him about his attire, I knew he'd say that for a trip to the police station, it never hurt to look one's best. It might be impressive at the right moment. He wore glasses with thin gold rims. His sunken cheeks and crinkles around his eyes added to the impression he gave everyone that with a few minor alterations, He could have been anyone's maiden aunt. He often sounded like it, too. I introduced him to Agnes. I've talked with several officials and a state's attorney, Todd said. We're not going to be able to meet with Meg for a while. When that happens, they might only permit me in. I explained about the meeting, then said Agnes was there. She might be able to give us information about what happened. Todd took out a yellow legal pad from his briefcase and prepared to take notes. Oh, where do I start? Agnes asked. Todd said, let's begin with all the details you can remember. Don't worry about not remembering everything. Take as much time as you need. She filled Todd in on the background about the election, then began giving details about the meeting. People spoke, shouted, argued. Nobody on their side made much sense. Your name came up, Tom. I don't care about that now. What's happening to Meg is what's important. Agnes smiled briefly. She vigorously rubbed her eyes with her fist and looked at us. I'm more tired than I've ever been in my life. I've never had a friend arrested before. The police were terribly polite, but terribly firm. At first, Meg was too stunned to make much protest. When she got her wits about her and figured out she was a suspect, she began demanding a lawyer. They weren't quite so polite after that. Then they took her away. The meeting, Todd prodded. If Belutha and her supporters used a shred of logic at the meeting, I didn't hear it. About the middle of the evening, Meg told Belutha Muffin she could take her Neanderthal views and shove them up her butt. When she said that, people got very angry. I'm afraid what happened next was rather undignified, but very funny. The silly cow Belutha finally lost that self-satisfied smile. She leaped across several chairs and charged Meg. Did Meg get hurt? Oh, no, not by that awful person. She stood her ground. Before Belutha was finished crossing the distance between them, she was all red in the face and puffing harder than a hurricane. I thought she was just short of a stroke. Belutha may have been too exhausted for physical abuse by then, but she let loose verbal blasts that were equivalent to any tornado. Meg's comment when Belutha finally ran down was a deadly quiet and perfectly calm. Why don't you just die, you silly bitch? I'm afraid that was the most controlled Meg was for quite a while. I said, I thought I was the only one who had to work on keeping calm in overwrought situations. Agnes chuckled. Perhaps you can take lessons together. After she made that crack, several people got between them. Jerome Blenkinsop was one of them. They had to drag poor Belutha away. She swore she'd get even with Meg in her liberal librarian ways. Belutha never did get to make her little speech against you. Tom, she was escorted out, and they called a recess. Later, Jerome asked to speak with Meg privately. Meg motioned me to follow. I guess she wanted a witness. When we were a little apart from the others, Jerome went nuts. I had no idea he was one of Belutha's supporters. I was taken off guard, and I think Meg was too. Emotions were running so high. Every time I turned around, someone seemed to be shouting. There weren't that many people nearby, but I'm afraid nearly everyone heard them. Jerome also ripped into you and your reputation. He was pretty angry you wouldn't support him in the election. If he was on Belutha's side, how could he have been interested in my support? He was desperate to win. He called you several unpleasant names. At one point, Jerome put his hand on Meg's elbow, but Meg yanked her arm away. What happened next is unclear. Someone claimed Jerome was pushed from behind. Whatever the cause, Jerome shoved Meg, who staggered back into me. Things became ugly. I'm afraid they both made threats they didn't mean. People got between them, and the incident ended. Everyone calmed down after that. When they resumed the meeting, their side suggested the elections be postponed because of all the turmoil. And that got shouted down. Eventually, we voted. Belutha won by 2 votes. I raised an eyebrow. Agnes said, The good guys lost. It happens more often than people care to admit. One of your strongest supporters did get elected vice president. It took a while to count the votes, but after they announced the results, the meeting began breaking up. Knots of people hung around discussing strategies, tactics, issues, and personalities. When we were ready to leave, Meg couldn't find her purse. She had stopped in the library earlier, but she knew she had it with her at the meeting because she had notes in it. She distinctly remembered taking them out before she went to the podium to speak. I don't recall seeing her with the purse, nor did I notice that she didn't have it. Because of the size of the crowd, we had the meeting in the gym. She even got a couple of custodians to pull out the bleachers and check under there. She began to think it had been stolen. Before making accusation, she figured she'd better check the library, just to be sure it wasn't there. At that point, she went to the library, and I went to wait out by the car. The room had been stifling humid all night, and I wanted to get some fresh air. All the rest of this, Meg told me while we waited for the police to arrive and before she got arrested. It took them forever to do their investigation. When she arrived in the library, she noticed several books were strewn on the floor down a nearby aisle. Meg's always very conscientious. She'd never leave a book out of place. She knew she hadn't done it and that they hadn't been out of place earlier. She began a circuit of the perimeter of the room. Before she was a third of the way around, she saw a body. She realized right away it was Jerome. She didn't see him breathing. Agnes drew a deep breath. Meg was very subdued when she told me all this. I've never seen her so shaken. I would have been too. Finding a dead body has got to be the worst thing. She took a lace handkerchief out of her purse and dabbed at the film of moisture on her upper lip. What else did she say? Todd prodded gently. That it was eerie. Her exact words were, I think of myself as cool, calm, and witty. I was none of those either at the meeting or at that moment. I don't know how anybody could have been. I said, those were more difficult circumstances than any of us ever want to be in. Agnes wrapped her arms around herself, pulled in another deep breath, and resumed. She didn't remember a conscious decision to act. She ran to the phone in her office, dialed 911, then locked up the room as tightly as possible. Then she began hunting for help. Everyone else was gone by that point, except the janitors. She finally hurried out to where I was. We found the janitors together. I was there when she talked to the police initially. She told them the whole story, including the part about hunting for her purse. That's important because they found it lying 3 feet from Jerome's body. Agnes sighed. She had no idea how it got there. After she finished her story, the police began badgering her. I guess they found the purse pretty quickly. Others must have told them about what happened at the meeting. Did Meg remember seeing the purse when she saw the body? Todd asked. She didn't think so. The police implied she dropped it in her confusion after the murder. If it wasn't there, Todd said, then obviously someone got into the library after she left. I said, or the murderer was still there, watching her all the time. Agnes shuddered. This is more than a bit much. She also has keys to the library, Todd asked. I said, after all these years, I doubt if anybody really knows, even without a key. Access to any of our rooms isn't difficult to flip with a credit card and you're in. Of course, the janitors would have keys. Can you give us a list of who else was at the meeting, Todd asked. Usually, less than 10 show up. Tonight there were about 25 teachers and maybe 75 people from the community. I can try writing down some names for you later. Carolyn Blackburn, the school superintendent, was there, but she was talking to reporters for a short while afterwards and then left. Edwina skulked out before the reporters could get hold of her. Let me think. She paused for a moment. Both candidates for union president were there, as well as Beatrix Zuri. She tried to make a statement about some field trip. She was mostly ignored. She got mad and left early. Meg pointed out to me somebody named Trevor Thompson, but I'm not sure who he was. A friend of yours, Tom, I think? I know who he is. He sat in the back and never said a word. Seth, the other candidate for union president, was there. He didn't say anything. I'm not sure I could remember everybody. Don't worry about it, Todd said. The police can probably give us the names later. We've got to work on bail. Has she ever been arrested? Not that I know of, I said. Todd nodded. I'll know more in an hour or two. I'm worried, Agnes said. I know Meg didn't do it. It's just a matter of finding out who did or proving her innocence or both. She patted my arm. You should be glad you weren't at the meeting. It was not pretty. I said, I'm going to do some investigating on my own. I'll call you if I find anything out. She gave me another hug and left. I followed Todd back out front, then asked him, "Now what?" "We aren't sure she wants me as her attorney. I'll get an answer to that, and then I'll find out about a preliminary hearing. Bail for a murder charge isn't going to be cheap. Does she have the money?" "If she doesn't, Scott and I do." "Good to know. I'll work on it and get back to you. If what Agnes said about what the police have is accurate, they are starting with a strong case. Unless they happen upon another suspect, she is in deep trouble." Todd left. By this time, the day shift had come on duty. The person behind the reception desk might have been the same guy I saw earlier this morning, or his identical twin. This time, when I asked for Frank, I was told he was in. I sat in Frank's office. He wore the same brown suit he wore 90% of the time. I don't know if he had just the one suit or whole racks full of brown suits that he kept in heaps on the floor, so they'd all look equally rumpled. He said, "I hear and see you're a big star now." "Yeah, fame is as much fun as being run over by a tank." "That happened to you often?" "What?" "That tank thing." "Only this year you should try being famous." "No thanks." "You heard Meg Swarthmore's been arrested?" "Who is she?" "A librarian at the school. A good friend of mine." "I vaguely recall who she is. What'd she do?" "Nothing. They think she killed Jerome Blenkinsop." "One of the teachers?" "What evidence do they have?" I told them about the purse, their fingerprints, and their dislike for each other. "I don't know, Tom. It's not my case. I'll keep my ears open, but I can't do much for her or you." "I'm going to ask people questions." "Keep out of the way of the detectives. None of them are nearly as sweet as I am." "Who could be?" "I knew he'd help me as best he could if I went home. I suspected I wouldn't be able to get any sleep. I was too concerned about Meg. I left and drove to the Frankfurt Villa Inn on LaGrange Road in Frankfurt to grab some breakfast, then hurried to school. Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold: to offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides, and in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.